When a sleeve is drafted, the measurement of the sleeve cap is created slightly larger than the measurement of the armhole it is getting sewn into. This helps to create a three-dimensional shape over the top of the shoulder. For sewing the sleeve into the armhole, techniques must be used to help that larger measurement of the sleeve ease into the smaller measurement of the armhole. One of those techniques is crimping. To crimp our sleeve cap, we're going to be stitching at a 1/2 inch seam allowance from the double notch at the back of the sleeve all the way around the top of the cap until we reach the single notch at the front of the sleeve. We'll be stitching it at 1/2 inch seam allowance, but we'll be doing a very special maneuver along the way. Begin by positioning your fabric at the double notches, the higher one, the one that's closer to the top of the sleeve cap, and then you'll want to have the edge of your fabric on the 1/2 inch seam allowance line. You're going to take one of your fingers and place it at the back of the presser foot, and you're going to press and hold it down there throughout the duration of us stitching around the sleeve cap. We're going to see the excess fabric gather and scrunch up behind the presser foot, and you have to keep holding it there as we sew all the way around. So I'm going to begin to sew, and I'm still just holding everything in place with that finger as the fabric scrunches up behind. I'm using my other hand to help guide the fabric in front of the presser foot on the 1/2 inch line. Definitely best to take this kind of thing in small sections. And see, I truly have not moved my finger at the back of the presser foot. You can see all the excess fabric building up there. Keep it there. Don't move your finger. Also be sure that you're not stretching the fabric in front of you as you sew this, or else you'll kind of negate the crimping process. So just gently guide it without stretching and let it build up behind the foot. Okay, now we've reached our notch. After your sleeve has been crimped, you can see it starting to form the cap of the sleeve. It now has this subtle cupping shape so that the fabric can cup over the shoulder as your sleeve gets sewn into the armhole. The main goal is just being sure that you didn't actually catch any folds or gathers along the way. It's more about the fabric just gently easing inward, meaning the yarns are compressing together into a slightly smaller space. After your sleeve has been crimped, you'll want to place it in your sewing notebook with the wrong side facing up. Gathering is a design feature that pulls the fabric into small folds and helps create fullness around an area of the body. We're going to be creating a bodice with gathers under the bust area and sewing it into a midriff panel. Our gathers are only going to happen in 2 sections, and those sections are indicated by our notches. As you can see, our bodice is much larger than our midriff, so the gathers are going to help those 2 pieces become the same size. However, we're only going to be creating gathers in 2 sections, and those sections are indicated by our notches. If we look at our bodice here, there are 4 notches on here, and there are also 4 notches on the midriff. We'll be matching all of those eventually as we sew it together, but our gathers are only going to sit in these 2 sections. If we compare the measurement of the bodice to the midriff in those areas, you could see that the bodice is much larger. So this will be the area we are gathering, and we'll be doing the same thing on this side. The side areas, as well as the center section, will not have any gathers. We can already kind of see right off the bat that they're approximately the same measurement as one another. Since our gathers will only happen in 2 sections, we will be sewing gathering stitches that sit only in those areas. Let's begin by indicating a wrong side to both of our fabric pieces. To sew gathering stitches, you'll want to begin by changing your machine's stitch length to a longer stitch, around 4 or 5 millimeters. We're going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches in each of the designated gathered areas. We'll sew 1 row at a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a second row at 5/8 seam allowance. Having the two rows will help our fabric gather more evenly across those areas. In sewing a gathering stitch, one of the most important things to keep in mind is you want to have a little bit of length to your threads, about 6 inches or so at both the beginning and end of your seams, and you will not want to backstitch at either end. So I'm going to bring in my fabric, and here's the first notch at the beginning of my first gathered section. I'm going to start sewing here with 1/4 inch seam allowance until I reach the next notch. As you pull your fabric away, you'll want to be sure to hold the threads tightly as you pull so that the fabric doesn't begin to gather up too soon. And cut your thread so that you have a few inches hanging off the end of the fabric. After the 1/4 inch line, now we're going to sew the same section again at 5/8 seam allowance. Now you repeat the same thing for the second gathered section. So if we could see where we left off, we're now going to skip over this middle portion, and this next notch before the next slightly curved section is where we will begin. So first sew 1/4 inch. And then come in again and sew the same area at 5/8. After sewing the gathering stitches, it's now going to be time to pull the threads and create our gathers. I have the wrong side of the bodice facing up, and I'm just going to grab the 2 threads that are on top at the end of my gathering stitches for the first section. An important thing is to make sure that you only grab the threads from the upper side of the fabric, not the ones that are coming out from below. I'm going to grab both threads, and I also like to even kind of twirl them around my finger to give me a better grip. You want to be sure that you're pulling both threads evenly and not pulling one a little bit more or less than the other. So this kind of helps us to do that. I'm grabbing the threads tight, and now I'm going to pinch the fabric at the beginning of the stitches and pull. And as I do so, you can see all these little folds begin to form along the gathered stitched area. The goal is for the gathers between the notches to now become the same size as that same notched area on the midriff. We'll refine it a little more when we get to pinning them together, but it helps to get them started like this first. So now I'm going to do the same thing on my other gathered section. I'll come down here and grab both of the threads on the top side of the fabric, grip them tightly, pinch the fabric, and start to scoot the little gathers down along the threads. After the gathers have been started, we can begin to pin the bodice onto the midriff. We want to do so with the right sides of both pieces together. So I'm going to take my midriff and flip it in this direction so that the right side is facing up, and then have the right side of my bodice touch against the right side of the midriff with the notches of both pieces on the same side. I want to begin by matching the first 2 notches, and you'll pin the 2 pieces of fabric together with the pin pointed inward from the edge, as in perpendicular to the actual direction we'll be sewing. Then come to the next set of notches, match them up nicely, as well as matching the edges of the fabric, and pin, and repeat the same thing on this half. After pinning the notches together, also come over to the beginning and end of the seam. Match the corners of both pieces and pin them together. Now that all of our major checkpoints have been matched up, we want to come in and assess our gathered sections. The goal is to have gathered them enough so that they fit into the same space between the notches as our midriff. If you see that they're maybe not gathered enough, then you'll just want to pull the threads a little bit more until the gathered section shrinks up a little bit more. Once you see that the pieces do look to be about the same length, then you also want to come into your gathers and just adjust them a little bit to even them out along that section as much as possible. You just want to have the fabric as evenly distributed across the gathers as you can. Then it's helpful to come and place a couple pins in the gathered section as well to hold that distribution of the gathers. So I'm just going to check this one from the edge. Make sure the fabrics are the same measurement, as well as the gathers being evenly distributed. And pin again. Once your gathers have been spread out and the two pieces are pinned together, we're now going to finish by sewing across this entire seam at 1/2 inch seam allowance. We want to be sure that we've returned our machine to its normal stitch length of 2.5 millimeters though. We only use the long stitch length to help us in creating the gathers, but when we want a more permanent seam, we want that smaller stitch length back. So I'm ready to sew my midriff seam at 1/2 inch seam allowance, back to the 2.5 millimeter stitch length, and now we're ready to begin with a back stitch to secure our seam. After sewing our seam, now we can actually go back and remove those gathering stitches. We don't need them hanging around after they've done their job, and particularly that upper row is now visible from the outside of the garment. We don't want that. So come to the wrong side, which is the side that you pulled the threads on to begin with, and you should be able to just grab them and slide them right out, and then reach inside and make sure you pulled the bobbin thread as well. Finally, we can press our seam. We want to be pressing this seam allowance downwards toward the midriff. It kind of naturally wants to go that direction now that we have all the fullness from the gathers here. It ends up being a little kind of bulky sometimes if you decide to take that gathered area and press it back upward onto itself. So with the right side of the fabric facing up, make sure all your seam allowance is coming towards the midriff and run the iron across it. But when you come to your gathered sections, you don't want to take the iron and press on top of any of that at all, because then you'll just kind of smash down these lovely little folds you've created. So you really just want to only use the edge of your iron to barely get the midriff where it needs to fold backwards, but trying not to press the iron onto the gathered area. After pressing, present your sample in your notebook with the right side facing up. Spaghetti is a thin round tube of fabric that is often used for straps on a garment or to create a drawstring tie. We're going to be creating spaghetti with a strip of bias fabric, as well as using the tool, the loop turner or tube turner, to invert our tube of fabric after it has been sewn. To begin our spaghetti, we're going to take our strip of bias fabric and we want to fold it in half to bring the two raw edges together. We'll be stitching down the side with the raw edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. At the top here, the bias is cut at an angle, so you could ignore that section and just start sewing where the two layers are actually meeting one another. And you want to begin with a backstitch. As you bring the edges of your bias together, you just want to be sure that you're not stretching the fabric throughout this process. Just gently bring them together without pulling on it. You also want to really be sure that you keep your seam allowance consistent with this. If your stitch gets even a little bit too deep, the area that you have to turn right side out will become too tight and it will be impossible to flip around. As you come to the bottom, you'll also want to finish with a backstitch where the two layers end and it becomes the single layer angled section. Now that we've sewn our spaghetti into a tube, it's time to use the loop turner to invert it and turn the tube right side out so that our seam allowances end up on the inside of it. But first, we want to prep the end of our spaghetti so that the loop turner can do its job a little bit better. Take your scissors and we want to clip off the excess of spaghetti. We're cutting it straight across, right where your stitches actually begin. Then you want to come to the side that is your seam allowance and do a kind of low angled cut to skim some of that excess away, angling right up to where you began sewing. The loop turner has a little hook up at the top as well as this swinging arm that can open or close. We want to take note of these parts because when we have this inside, you'll need to locate this little swinging arm. Take the loop turner and starting in the bottom of your spaghetti, not the end that we trimmed, you're just going to stick it up inside and gently scrunch your fabric onto it till you're coming out towards the top. When you get to the top here, you want to look for the little hook and allow it to hook over the top edge of your fabric. Then feel around for that little swinging arm, which is probably in the downward facing position, and you want to use your thumbnail to kind of grab under it until it starts to poke out through the side of the fabric. Continue to pull it upwards with your thumbnail until it closes at the top and is meeting the hook. Once it's in this position and that arm is closed, you want to gently hold your spaghetti a little bit lower than where the hook is and start to pull so that you're pulling the hook inside of your spaghetti. You want to be sure to not grab any of this scrunchy excess and shove it down. Have the area you're working on near the hook be nice and smooth. The trickiest part is getting it started, but ultimately, you're trying to grab that outer layer and pull it down until the tube begins to pull inside itself. Once you're started, then you just want to slowly work it inward. See, I'm just grabbing little sections and sliding it down. But again, you don't want to grab higher up and scrunch fabric downward. It needs to be running over itself smoothly at the end. So even this could cause it to get a little bit jammed up. Only little bits and smooth pulling. You want to keep working at it, and eventually, at the beginning, you'll get to the point where the spaghetti will start to come outward. And then just continue pulling until you have turned the whole piece right side out. Because of the nature of bias, it may look a little ripply at first. Just kind of go back and use your fingertips to kind of roll it and smooth out those ripply poles. So it should end up becoming a nice round piece of spaghetti. You can also go ahead and unhook your loop turner as you continue to roll, and just work at it till it makes a nice pretty round tube. Your completed spaghetti should look uniform in width and have a nice even roll to it. Present your spaghetti in your notebook on its corresponding title page. When strips of bias are cut from fabric, their length is always limited due to the width of the fabric. Some projects require continuous pieces of bias, or pieces that are longer than the width of the fabric would normally allow, in which case segments of bias need to be joined together. For this technique, you want to start with one strip of bias, but we're going to be cutting it into two so we could really see the full process. Our strip already has a nice 45-degree cut at either end, but we're going to chop our piece in half 90 degrees to the edge of the bias in the middle. In doing so, we can observe the process of finding a 45-degree edge. So I'm just going to come right to the middle and cut my bias in half, square across. Next, on one of the pieces, come in with your gridded ruler, and you want to place the corner of the ruler on the corner of your fabric, so you can see how the edge of the fabric is cutting a perfect diagonal line through this row of squares from the corner straight to the number 2 mark. While you have the ruler in this position, come in and just mark along the edge of the ruler from the corner down. We've now created a perfect 45-degree line on which we can cut both of our strips of bias. Place the one with the mark right on top of the unmarked one, and just make sure everything is nicely aligned as you come in with your shears and cut the fabric on the line. We're going to be creating a diagonal seam that will join the two pieces of bias together. To position this though, you want to take the piece on the right and flip it downward. Imagine that you're bringing the right sides of the fabric together, and we'll be matching them up along this diagonal edge. But contrary to what we normally do, we're not going to be perfectly matching the corners of the fabric at both ends. If we were to perfectly match the corners at the beginning and end, and then sew across this at 1/4 inch or any other given seam allowance, our pieces would fold open, and what you would see is that the upper and lower edges are not continuous. And we want to make sure we have a nice, smooth, continuous piece on both sides. So to allow us to do that, we need to first draw a guideline showing exactly where we're going to sew, and that will help us position the pieces correctly. So I'm going to take this piece, and using my ruler, I'll draw a 1/4 inch guideline, since that will be our seam allowance for the bias joining. Now, as I go and place it back on top of the other, rather than matching the corners, as we saw earlier that we shouldn't do, instead, I want to still have these sides matched, but I want to slide the piece upward a little bit so that now my guideline where I've drawn it is meeting the upper edge of the piece, as well as down here at the bottom. The goal is to have your pencil line matched up with the long edges of the bias at the top and bottom. That way, when we come in and sew our seam at 1/4 inch seam allowance, our bias can unfold and have a nice continuous edge on both sides. When you go to join your bias, make sure you have the pieces positioned so that they form a 90-degree angle, and that the guideline you drew for your stitch line is meeting the edge of the other piece at both the beginning and down here at the end. And then you're going to sew on your guideline, which is 1/4 inch seam allowance. No backstitch is necessary for this process. After joining your bias, you'll want to press the seam allowances open. And then present it in your sewing notebook with the wrong side facing up. French bias is another method of clean finishing a neckline or armhole with bias binding. For this sample, we have the body of our garment with a neckline, and we'll want to indicate a wrong side, but then flip it over as we will be stitching the bias binding to our right side first. You will also need a 2-inch wide strip of bias. We'll be folding the bias in half to bring the raw edges of the fabric together, and then aligning those raw edges with our neckline as we stitch to the right side of the neckline at 1/4-inch seam allowance. To stitch our binding onto the neckline, we'll want to begin by folding the bias in half and aligning the raw edge to our neckline, with the bias sitting against the right side of our fabric. The bias is cut longer than we need, so we can leave a little bit of excess hanging off the beginning. We'll begin with a backstitch and then continue forward at 1/4-inch seam allowance. As we do this, you can take your neckline and bend it into a straight line while aligning all 3 edges of fabric together. You just want to be sure that you're not stretching anything, either the bias or the neckline. So fold, make sure you have 1, 2, 3, all edges aligned. When you get to the end, finish with a backstitch as well. After sewing the folded bias onto the neckline, go ahead and snip the excess bias away. And then it'll be time to press this, which is going to happen in a couple stages. First, you want to press the folded excess of your bias upwards. The seam allowance should also be going in the same direction, so nothing is going downward towards the body. And just carefully press along the stitch line. You don't want to extend your iron too high and end up with any extra folds in the bias. Next, flip your sample over. We're going to be continuing to wrap the bias down and around the seam allowances. And we want the folded edge of the bias to be coming lower than your stitch line by about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to fold it down and press. And just so you could see, if I turn it over, I want to see and feel that the fold on the underside is going lower than my actual seam line by about 1/8 of an inch. So it works nicely if you create your fold of the bias right where the edges of the seam allowances are. And since it's bias, it should kind of bend and contour nicely. So make sure it's creating a nice curve that follows the neckline as you press. After pressing your bias, if you have the right side of the body of your garment facing up, you should then be able to kind of see and feel this 1/8 of an inch extension of the fold of the underside of the bias going beyond your stitch line. We're going to be doing something called stitch in the ditch, which means sewing exactly in this seam line. In doing so, we should be catching the fold of our fabric on the other side. So the goal is that your sewing line is not going onto the bias in any way, it's just nestled right in that stitch line. We'll begin with a little backstitch. And then come forward and just make sure your needle is going right into the seam line. There's no guide on the throat plate to watch for this. You are truly just observing your needle and its placement in regards to the seam. Finish with a backstitch. When your French bias is completed, you should have on the right side a stitch neatly nestled into the seam that joins the binding to the neckline. And then on the wrong side, your stitch line should be 1/8 of an inch above the fold, grabbing that binding and holding it closed around the neckline. Give your sample a final press, and then present in your notebook with the right side facing up.